Thank you for the intro, Linda. So, yes, today I'm here to talk about retrospectives, but since it's nice to hear about other people's successes, but it's even better to hear about their failures. So that's why I'm going to talk about antipatterns. So I'm not going to tell you how you should do the retrospectives. I'm going to give you some antipatterns that you will see out there when you're facilitating retrospectives. So first, I'd like to know who I'm talking to. So please raise your hand if you've written a book about retrospectives. Please raise your hand if you have facilitated retrospectives. Please raise your hand if you have been into a retrospective. And now for the brave ones, raise your hand if you don't know what a retrospective is. Wow, yeah, let's give them a hand. So funnily enough, the reason that I got interested in retrospectives was because I was at a talk by Linda Rising, and she asked that question. I said, I don't know anything about retrospectives, I'm just coming to listen to you, because I always like listening to you. And because I was brave enough to say that out loud, she gave me a book by Norm Kurth about project retrospectives, and I think Linda mentioned that book earlier today. But a little bit more about me. I put speakers on stage. So I invite speakers to conferences similar to this conference. I mess with the heads of students. I'm teaching at the University of Aarhus in computer science, and I'm now also teaching how to teach computer science to the teachers at computer science. And that's why my company is called Meta Developer. And then I'm making developers communicate, and that's why I'm here today, because I like to try to make developers communicate about the things that went well and the things that went less well. So that's me. And what you will get out of this talk is a bunch of antipatterns for retrospectives. And I hope that what you'll get out of that is that you'll be aware that now I'm entering into this antipattern. So I should do something differently than what I'm doing right now. And then there'll be a surprise, because I really hate listening to people for 50 minutes. I find it really boring, except if it's Linda. So what I've done is that I've put in 2 breaks where I'm talking about something completely different. And if you're not interested in what I'm talking about, you can choose that time to look at your phone or think about what you'll have for dinner or something like that. It's perfectly fine, just do something else than thinking about retrospectives, okay? So the antipatterns that I'm going to talk about are named after the problem that they are. Prime directive ignorance, the wheel of fortune, death by postponement, let's get it over with, in the soup, and do-it-yourself retrospectives, and then there'll be 2 extra patterns. So that's what I'm going to go through, and then I'll remind you in the end what I said, because it's late in the evening, so it'll be difficult to stay awake for the whole talk. Luckily, it's very bright up here, and I can't really see you, so I can't see if you're sleeping. It's quite all right. But what is an antipattern actually? How many of you know what an antipattern is? Okay, so most of you know what it is. My example here is the Blob antipattern, and I don't know how many of you know the old science fiction movie, The Blob, but it's about a blob that falls down from the sky, and it's actually a black blob, but I didn't have black color, so it'll just be red in this story. It's a black blob, and then it's oozing around the earth, and whenever it meets something, it just it becomes part of the blob. So the trees and the people all become part of the blob. And the blob is the name of an architectural antipattern, which is about whenever you have a new functionality, you put that into your primary class of your system. And you just keep putting things into this class. And the problem is that if you have a big class with all the functionality, it's really difficult to maintain, and it's really difficult for other people to understand what's actually happening, because you have a mess with the responsibilities. So in the anti-patterns, what you get is you get the context, as you do in patterns, and then you get the description of the anti-pattern solution, which is the thing that you will do without thinking about it, without being aware of the anti-pattern. and then you'll get the consequences. But then the extra thing in the anti-pattern is that you actually get a refactored solution to the problem. So it will show you what the problem is, and then it'll say, so this is the way to get away from this problem. And for the blob, the thing that you do is that you take this big, huge blob, and then you divide it into different classes with their own responsibility. So this is what we now call microservices. So that's actually using the blob pattern is microservices. So that's anti-patterns for you, and that's what I'm going to talk about with respect to retrospectives. But I'm going to start with a little story. So there was this little Danish company called Titanic, which made reliable navigation software for ships, but it started having a really bad reputation. Things went wrong, and they didn't really know what to do about it. It was like a big ship corporation. And then some of their leaders said, hey, we'll make it agile. We'll start using Scrum. That's the solution to everything, so that's what we'll do. So one of the teams consisted of the 6 people you can see up here, Nikki, Susan, Peter, Robert, Sarah, and Jim. And they sent all of them to a Scrum Master course. And then Sarah was the one who became the Scrum Master because she was interested in it. And now since she was the Scrum Master at the Scrum course, she was told that she was to facilitate the retrospectives. So they started scrumming. They worked with their software. And after the first 2 weeks, she was supposed to facilitate her first retrospective. And now because she was a very good girl, she had been reading up about retrospectives. And one of the things she had been reading was the book by Norm Kurth. And Norm Kurth has this prime directive which says, regardless of what we discover, we must understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job he or she could, given what was known at the time, his or her skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. But she knew that wouldn't go well with the developers of that company, because they couldn't really truly understand and believe that people weren't just idiots who messed things up all the time. So she knew she couldn't do that. So she decided not to think about this prime directive. And she just started facilitating the retrospective. And the thing that should have been a blameless retrospective, where you're supposed to look at the whole system instead of finding scapegoats, turned into a session which was a blameful retrospective. And they were talking about the reason why this build failed was because of Peter, because he really made a stupid mistake. And Susan didn't even read the requirements written in that story, and that's why it was problematic. So people were trying to blame people instead of finding the fault in the system and trying to fix the system. And this is something that often happens with retrospectives, is that people do not want to show the developers this prime directive because they think it's ridiculous and stupid. And there's a lot of debate on exactly that prime directive on the internet if you're interested in seeing all the different viewpoints on it, because people cannot simply and truly believe that people are always doing the best. So that's why I have my first pattern is the prime directive ignorance. And I think it's very important to think about the prime directive. I'm not saying that you should always read it aloud, but I'm saying that you, in some way, maybe in the language that they use, shall make people know that that is a mindset you want them to take to the retrospective. That we're not trying to find somebody to blame, but that we're trying to find faults in the system that we together can fix. But the problem is that if people don't believe in the prime directive, they won't use it. And if they won't use it, it fails. So it's the same as the Yoda vision that other people talk about, that is so much about in Scrum, that Yoda has the intelligence of saying, well, you have to actually do it to make it work. You have to believe in it. So the description of the anti-patterns I have are formed on the same way that the anti-patterns for software is formed. That first you have a problem. The problem is it feels awkward to follow the directive because you can't really make people believe that this is true. And the anti-pattern solution is just to forget about it. Don't think about the prime directive because it's ridiculous anyway. And the consequences is that people bring all the negative expectations and assumptions to the meeting, and people are being scapegoated for the things that they've done instead of trying to figure out how could they make this work better. The anecdotal evidence, which means how do you know that you're in this antipattern, is that people don't really listen to each other. They're just hearing what they want to hear. And little by little, people start becoming afraid of going to retrospectives, and then they'll stop going. And then if a big amount of the team is not coming to retrospectives, it's not the team solving the problems anymore. So the refactor solution is to bring this prime directive into the retrospectives in some way or the other. You have to figure out on your own what works best for your team, but try to find that blameless culture and to introduce that to the people. So that was the first anti-pattern. And it's very important to bring this. How many of you are actually bringing this to retrospectives already? A few hands, right? 5, 10% maybe. So it's something to consider, definitely. It helps. So a few more weeks go by, and she comes to the next retrospective to facilitate, and she has heard that what you do is that you ask the developers to put up post-its on a poster saying, what should we start doing, what should we stop doing, what should we do more of, what should we do less of. I believe that a lot of people are facilitating retrospectives like that. And one of the things that came up was that they should do more pair programming. So, right, one of their goals for this retrospective is we should do more pair programming. And they wrote down maybe 3 hours twice a week, everybody should do pair programming. But the problem is that at the next retrospective, the same problem will come up. They're not doing the pair programming, even though they decided to do the pair programming. And that's why I've called this the Wheel of Fortune. Because if you're just directly focusing on the problems and then going to the solutions, then there are some things that you miss. Because if they had spent some time looking at why do we not make pair programming, maybe they would have understood that Peter and Jim are very introvert people and they hate pair programming. They cannot work in that way. So even though you decide as a team that we should have more pair programming, it will not work because they'll try to avoid it in all the ways that they can. So the Wheel of Fortune is the name I've given the anti-pattern because I think it's like spinning one of these wheels. Because sometimes when you just jump into start with, stop with, you're lucky and you're solving the actual problem. But other times you're just solving a symptom of a much bigger problem. So the refactored solution of this anti-pattern is to try to actually look at the causes behind these problems that people see. So instead of just when they say we need more retrospectives or we need more pair programming, instead of just doing that, try to look at why do we not have pair programming, or why does this test fail, or why is our communication with this other team so bad. Try to delve down into the causes. Actually follow the 5 phases of the retrospective. So first you set the stage. Everybody is in a circle. And yes, I expect people to be in a circle. And yes, sometimes they hate it. But I really think that having people in a circle where everybody can see each other and nobody is at the end of the table, and preferably they're in a circle with no furniture in between them, and everybody gets to say something, it's a really important start of a retrospective, setting this stage. Because if you allow people to be silent already from the beginning, then it's much easier for them to stay silent during the meeting. So getting that connectedness, togetherness, they don't have to hold hands, they can do that. That's what I say to them. You don't have to touch each other, but it's okay by me. So, but just to make them understand that they're together as a team. And then you gather data. And one of my preferred ways of doing that is just to have a timeline showing what happened since the last retrospective, the good things, the bad things, the things that still puzzles me. And then the thing that is really, really important and really, really difficult is to look at this map of data and try to generate the insights. Try to find the causes behind these things. Try to dig the goal, find the stories behind these. Why did this happen? You can use the 5 whys, where you're digging into the causes behind things, or you can use the fishbone, where you look at different aspects of causes behind this problem. But it is a very important stage, and a stage that people often overlook. And it is really, really difficult sometimes for me to get the developers to stop looking at the solutions right away. It's as if even when they are formulating the problem, they're giving me the solution. They're saying, this build failed, and we have to get this new technology, and we have to get people on a course to learn to use this, and that'll be the solution to this. So no, we have to try to keep the options open, which is really, really hard. We have to try to start a conversation which opens up suggestions for courses behind these things before we start closing it with solutions. But I find that one of the hardest things. There's no easy solutions to this. And then the next thing is decide what to do. And then, of course, again, closing the retrospective is important. To say, now we've been through these things, we've looked at this data, we decided to focus on these problems, we went to the courses, we decided to brainstorm on solutions, and we voted for solutions, and now we've written them down as long-term or short-term goals. And that I have found is important, because sometimes when I forget to do that, people say, why did we make that decision? I'm sure it was Aino who made that decision, because she was definitely one at the board all the time, and she likes to talk. But it's very important that the team knows that they made the decision, and that they took all the steps to come to this decision, to do these things, to have these actions. And that's why I think it's very important to summarize what actually happened at this retrospective. And it is good for a retrospective facilitator to be invisible and just be part of the wall and let the team do their work. But it can be very difficult, especially if you, like me, really like to be on stage and talk all the time. But it's something that can be learned, I'm sure. Now, this is the point where it's beginning to be dreadful to listen to me. So now I'm going to something completely different. So there are 2 people on this team, Sarah and Robert, and they're interested in each other. You can see that from that picture. It's very typical for women to touch their hair if they're interested in the man they're talking to, or if they have lice. But in this case, we try to focus on her being interested in him. And he is definitely interested in her. But he is not really good with women. He doesn't know how to talk to women. He's never had a girlfriend. He's never dated. So what does he do? He asks somebody else on the team. He asks for help, which is also a very good pattern in itself. So he asks Jim, what do I do? And Jim says, you can read this yourself. So Jim says, there is this book you can read. And Robert says, no, that can't be true. I never heard of a book like that. You can't have a book like that. Yes, there is a book like that, actually. And one of the patterns in that book is called the Decorated Visitor Honeypot. How many of you know the Decorated Visitor Honeypot? Yeah. Those of you who heard me speak before know that. So there is a problem. You want to connect to and create conversational state with women, but you want them to do all the work. Sounds familiar? I think it does. The forces are, there has to be women in your realm. You can't apply this pattern unless there are actually women around, because then it doesn't work. If it is women you want to attract, of course. It could be anything human. Women notice their surroundings much more than men. I guess you have noticed that as well. They notice when there's new paint, they notice when you've got a saying on your t-shirt, they notice when there's chocolate around them. And women are skilled at obtaining excuses to starting seemingly innocent conversations with men they're interested in, which you should be aware of, because if they start talking about something insignificant, it could be the start of something very significant, and you should jump to that chance. Be polite about it, of course. The solution is to establish an appealing environment and indirectly initiate the connections, which are then initiated by others. So, as always with patterns, the abstract solution is really abstract, and you have to look into the implementation hints to see how can I actually do this, because most of you would probably like to make that appealing environment, but you don't really know how to do it. So here are some tricks. So the first thing that you should do is that you should expose interests. You should show them what you're interested in. It could be singing in a choir, it could be riding a motorbike, it could be climbing Mount Everest or something like that. Just find pictures of yourself doing that, or posters of when you have to sing in a choir. It could also be the kitty puppy angle, that you bring pictures of kittens or puppies, or you bring actual kittens or puppies to work, which can have some other problems, but bringing a kitten to work is really a woman magnet. It works wonders. And also babies. Babies work very well, as I've seen when my husband bring our children to the public pool. He's like surrounded by young women immediately, which is why he never gets to do that anymore. And you can decorate yourself. That is probably something that some engineers forget, that it's not a bad idea to decorate yourself. And when I say decorate, you don't need to wear makeup and stuff like that. You can do that, but again, it depends who you want to attract. But something that is interesting is, for instance, to have a t-shirt with a beautiful picture or something in Finnish, because then the women have an excuse to come up and ask you, what does that mean? Or where's that beautiful picture from? And then they have initiated a discussion, and then you can talk about that. Chocolate is good. Expensive chocolate is even better. If it's got glittery paper, it's really good. There's some benefits and drawbacks. Benefit is, of course, that the women who walk by will do the work for you. They will initiate discussions. But the drawback is that it can be costly, because expensive chocolate tends to be expensive. Yeah. So, but it really works. And another problem is you may oversell yourself. So you could have faked the picture where you're climbing Mount Everest. But if it then turns out that she is actually an avid climber, you might die. So there's really some things to be aware of here. It's not just fun and games. A related pattern is the unexpected resource god, where you always walk around with a backpack with things that women might need, an umbrella, of course, with your telephone number in it so they can bring it back, headache pills, chocolate, things like that. And this, as I have to say, it also works for men who are married already. So starting a conversation with your wife is actually not a bad idea from time to time. I think, well, maybe not for everybody, but for some people it'll be good to talk to your wife from time to time. So it's also for you, even if you are married. And all these patterns are from a book, which is called the Dating Design Pattern book, that you can buy. And it's this book that you probably know, the Gang of 4 Design Patterns, is actually a quick cover-up for this Dating Design Pattern book. You can read the story about that on the internet. But let's go on with our story. So, Susan is still the Scrum Master, and now, between week 4 and 6, she's still waiting for the next retrospective. Things start popping up, like a build continues to break, Peter continues to work from home. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad to work from home, but it can be a smell. It can mean that there's something that he doesn't like in the workplace. So sometimes it's a good idea to talk to people if they're changing habits like that. But the problem was that since this team knew that there was a retrospective, they would just save up all their problems for that retrospective. So they wouldn't just solve the problems when they met them, they would wait until the retrospective. And that's why I call this pattern the death by postponement. And the problem is actually real. I've seen it many times that people say, well, we don't have to talk about this right now, we can wait for the retrospective. And the problem is that, of course, the solution is delayed because it has to wait for the retrospective, but it also impacts the retrospective because one of the beautiful things that happens at retrospectives is that new things come up because people share experiences, or they find the causes behind the solution, or behind the problems. And if you save all the things that are obvious, that everybody knows about already, then you don't have time enough to dig for the gold, to find the new things that should pop up. So the refactor solution is to raise the problem when it occurs, of course. It seems very obvious, and again, an abstract solution is not always good enough. So what could we do to implement this abstract solution? One thing that Linda once told me about was a real-time timeline. And how many of you heard Linda talking about that earlier today? Yeah, so I don't have to go into much detail about that, but that's actually a really good way of taking advantage of people knowing what is happening from a day-to-day basis. So now, if you make people have a real-time timeline in their project room or in their team room or maybe online if they're a distributed team, then you can, when there's a cluster of red nodes, you might be able to take care of it at exactly that time instead of waiting for the retrospective. So a real-time timeline is something that I often suggest to people, even if they don't seem to have this problem, but simply so that people also can have a place to put their frustrations up. But also, sometimes when I come to retrospective, people have forgotten what happened 2 or 3 weeks ago. And then the only things that they put up on the timeline are the things that happened within the last 3 or 4 days. So it's also a good way of starting the retrospective with some data already gathered, as long as you give them time to gather more data. But the weeks pass, and we start hearing different things from the team. We do not really get anything out of the retrospective. Time for coding is much more important. We're wasting time on these retrospectives. They always blame me for this and that at the retrospective, and I'm sure we could do this retrospective in half the time. I mean, we're spending so much time just discussing things that we don't really change anyway because we choose to change something else, so it's just a waste of time. And when you hear this, when you hear these things from people in the team, you're in the anti-pattern that's called let's get it over with. And the problem with the let's get it over with situation is that it actually deteriorates the retrospectives because they say, well, we can do it quickly, or we can do it in half the time, maybe just cut 10 minutes, maybe just cut 15 minutes, and slowly but surely the retrospectives will vanish. Because if you cut down a retrospective to, say, 45 minutes or half an hour, you don't have time to go through all the phases. You don't have time to listen to everybody. And then they will not get as much out of it, and then they will be a waste of time, and then they will stop spending time on the retrospectives. So it's very important to be aware of this anti-pattern, let's get it over with, when people start saying, let's shorten this down, let's make this shorter because we don't really need that time. It can be a step in the wrong direction. And one thing you could do to restart the retrospectives is to get somebody else to facilitate the retrospectives so that you can see what's happening to the people. If you're the Scrum Master or the one who's often facilitating, look at somebody else facilitating the team. Try to find some new activities on the internet or buy a book. But even more important, ask questions. Try to figure out why they think that the retrospectives are a waste of time. But also try to figure out which problems that they have. Norm Kurth once said to me, I asked him, how do I sell retrospectives? And he said, you don't sell retrospectives. Nobody wants to buy a retrospective, really. But they want to have a solution to their problems. So instead, ask them questions about how they're doing, what their problems are. And then you can say, well, let's try this. It happens to be a retrospective, but who cares about the name? Try to figure out why it's not happening and why they might need some help. But how is Robert doing? Just one more dating pattern, I promise you. But I just really like them. So the surprise statefulness. I've taken this because the problem is that Robert really attracted her to his cubicle. But now he doesn't really know how to continue the conversation with her. She will come into his cubicle, ask questions, he'll smile, he'll answer, and nothing else happens. So surprise statefulness is you want to convince the target female that you're a package of extremely desirable resources, which is what men need to do. Because to women, all men seem alike, and you need to stick out to show that you have the good genes, well, just taking it biologically. So you have to show that you are special. And the way that you can show that you are special is to listen to her and remember what she has said, making her private data persistent. And you know for how long you need to remember what she has said? 3 weeks. 3 weeks is enough to make an impression. It would be nice if they could remember it forever, I agree. But just 3 weeks is actually enough to stick out from the other crowd. So use optimistic persistence to implement explicit storage and retrieval of her private attributes. But again, this is an abstract solution. Let's look at the implementation details. So there are 2 obvious strategies. It's like the standard text retrieval strategy, where you just ask her, for instance, if she said, oh, I bought a little puppy, and you ask her, how is the puppy doing? And then you have the object instantiation strategy, which is if she's told you about a band that she really likes, you can buy her a CD, or you can say to her, do you know that they're playing in the park next month? And then find some tickets. So you can use those different strategies. It takes considerable investment up front. Do you know why it takes considerable investment up front? Because you have to listen to what she's saying, to everything she's saying. And that's why I have this related pattern, interested listener, where you implement the interface look as though you're listening, which is really important when you're listening to a woman. You have to try actually to look as if you're listening. It's an important part of it. You could have dirty reads, which is not very good. And dirty reads it's got nothing to do with dirty, but it's simply the database term that if she told you she had this little puppy and she later told you the puppy is dead, don't ask about the puppy. So you don't just read from the earlier part of the database. Look at the timestamps, and also look at the IDs. If one woman tells you one thing, and another woman, and you ask another woman about it, it's a really bad idea. I have my second marriage, and sometimes my husband says, that must be your first husband you're talking about. And that's, ooh, it's not very good. But if you can do all these things, you get a corresponding high return, because no other man will be able to provide these resources. So 3 weeks, just listen and remember for 3 weeks, not bad. Let's go back to our story. Week 8 to 10. The boss will never allow it. The team says about things. We always discuss the testing framework. Nothing ever happens. Why can the retrospectives not help us? We have all these retrospectives. We spent time. It changes nothing. We never get anything changed. And these things you hear, if people keep discussing the same things over and over again, it's like Groundhog Day. We're always having these things. We're always discussing these things. And that is when you find yourself in the soup. So in the soup means that you are working on things that the team cannot change. And the important thing about retrospectives is that it's a team thing. We should discuss things that the team can actually take actions with and do things about. If we are always discussing how the other team should work, or what our boss should say, or where the company should be placed, it's obvious that these things keep popping up. So trying to look at the problems that you talk about and see, well, where do they actually belong? Do they belong into the circle where we can do something about it, or do they belong to the soup, where we cannot really do anything about it? Because the problem is that if you keep having these things popping up and you keep hearing people saying it's worthless to have these retrospectives, then they'll stop having the retrospectives, because it is worthless to have retrospectives where you talk about what other people should do. It doesn't really change anything. Here's an example. What I sometimes do when we have looked at the different data, it could be on a timeline or something else, I ask them to say, well, I have these 3 circles. There's some things you can do something about, there's some things you can influence, and then you have the soup. Where should these problems go? And then we can focus on working on the things where you can do, And we can look at if there are some things in the influence we can actually do, maybe send an email to somebody. And the things in the soup, maybe you just have to accept that this is how it is, or change your job. And then sometimes when you are delving into the causes behind these things, when you're going to the generate insights, sometimes magic happens. And it turns out that the things you thought you were only able to influence, you could actually do something about. And the things that you thought were in the soup, you might be able to influence. So instead of just thinking about them on the level that they are when you just describe them, if you generate the insight and see the causes, then maybe you're actually able to do something different. So for instance, if you think that the communication with the testers is bad, one thing you could do maybe is to move closer to the testers. And that leaves this problem in the doing circle instead of in the influence. And also if you want to change the location of the company, that might not be something you could do. But maybe you could come up with reasons for a local hub. So maybe you can actually influence it, or at least you can say, well, now we've tried. These are the reasons why a local hub would be great, because we don't have to travel so far and so long, and we would be more close together. So I think it's very interesting, to divide these things in what you can do, what you can maybe just influence, and what is in the soup. Very important to look at that, but also interesting to look at how when you're generating insights, a thing can move around. They might not be what they seem. So the week passes, and now people are saying the retrospectives are so boring. Really not high energy. We should have a better facilitator. And actually sometimes Susan says to herself, well, maybe I would like to actually be facilitated in a retrospective. Maybe I could get something out of them as well, instead of just focusing on being the facilitator. And when you hear this, you're often in what I call the do-it-yourself retrospectives. And the do-it-yourself retrospectives is the situation you find yourself in when it's always a Scrum Master who facilitates a retrospective. It's nice and it's well known and it's what people say a Scrum Master should do, but it holds different potential problems. So what could happen at a retrospective where it's the same person facilitating is that you always do the same things. The person has one way of facilitating and maybe some activities that he or she likes to use, and they're never changed because it is his or her tool set. But another thing that I think is even more potentially dangerous is that if the Scrum Master is always the facilitator, then the Scrum Master is not really part of the retrospective. And that means that he or she is not part of the team and not part in finding the problems and even more important, figuring out what the actions should be. And if you're wearing two hats to a retrospective, you can't do both things at the same time. Either you're a facilitator who thinks about the time, thinks about the different agendas, looks at people, looks at their body language, trying to figure out who needs to talk, who needs to shut up, should we have a break, should we move to another thing, is this activity dead, have they discussed this too much? There's so many things to think about when you're a facilitator, so you don't have time to reflect about what happened. On the other hand, and this I've tried personally, is if you're facilitating your own team, it can be very hard not to join a discussion about something. And once you do that, once you really join a discussion about this, you forget about the time, you forget about the things that you should do as a facilitator. So it's not very good to always have the same facilitator. So the solution is to take turns in facilitating the retrospectives, or maybe even use an outsider as a facilitator. At the company I used to work for, Trifork in Denmark, we had a rotation scheme for facilitating our teams. So we simply had a Google spreadsheet where people signed up with their team saying, I would like to have a retrospective in this week, and this week, and this week. And then the people who would like to facilitate would say, I can do this and this and this, and then others maybe can do this. And of course, there are some teams who likes better to be facilitated by somebody more than some other people. And that is something you can take into account also when you're making these schemes, who wants to facilitate this group and who wants to be facilitated by this facilitator. But I can really recommend it, but also, of course, taking in an external facilitator. I'm sometimes called in as an external facilitator in companies where they used to facilitate each other, and then they ask me to come and facilitate just to see if they could learn something new and maybe do something different. And then the people who are normally facilitating can step back and actually take part in that retrospective. So these were the 6 retrospective antipatterns: Prime Directive, ignorance, the Wheel of Fortune, death by postponement, let's get it over with, in the soup, and do-it-yourself retrospectives. So the reason why I wanted to share this with you is that I really believe that one of the good things about antipatterns is the awareness about antipatterns. As with the Blob antipattern, once you see that everybody puts the functionality in the same class, you are aware that you're now entering a blob. You have a name for it. You can say, hey, Fred, aren't we entering the blob right now? Fred is just a great name to say together with Blob. So then you're aware of these things. And the same thing with these retrospective antipatterns. Oh, I think we're getting into do-it-yourself retrospectives now. Should we try to make a rotation of the facilitation? Or are we being a little ignorant about the Prime Directive right now? So I want you to have awareness, and then I added the dating patterns just for fun. But what happened to Robert and Sarah? I'm sure you're all thinking about this right now. You need to have the ending of the story. And the ending of the story was that Sarah had told Robert that she was singing in a choir, and he showed that he had listened and remembered her data by actually showing up when her choir sang, and she saw him in the audience, and well, they went out for a drink, and now they're happily married and have 5 children. So that's what happened to Robert and Sarah. And what happened to Susan at the little team? Well, Susan started to rotate the facilitation with the others so that she could take part in it herself. They found a way to remember each other about the Prime Directive in a fun way for each start of it, like having examples of things that people could say that were really nasty. They liked that way. They're different ways of doing this. So she became a more skilled facilitator, and she started to enjoy it a lot more. And some people think in patterns, some people don't. That actually concludes my discussion or presentation. Yeah. But there's time for extra subjects, and I brought some if you don't have any questions. Yeah.
Okay, what's it going to be? Questions, or should she talk for?
I can just
oh, we have a question.
Thank you. Is there any advantage of having the facilitator in the team? You mentioned the disadvantage potentially.
Yeah. So now it's a good question. Facilitating a retrospective is a lot about trust. It's very important that people trust the facilitator not to talk about what is said at the retrospective to other people. And it's very important that everybody feels secure and safe in that environment. And of course, they need to trust the facilitator a lot to be able to talk about the things that are difficult. And that, I would think, is the advantage of having the facilitator be part of the team. Unless, of course, that person is somebody they don't trust. But that would be the only thing I thought about. Thank you. Yeah, there's one there.
I was just thinking, do you think it's better to have regular retrospectives even if no one can come up with something new, I should say almost, or something that we can't change, or yeah? Or should they be on a need basis?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Do we really need retrospectives on a regular basis if nothing new comes up and if we don't find any things to improve? That is a question I get all the time, actually. And also from some teams, they're saying, we're a really good team, everything is going well, we don't really need to talk about these things. And it would be great if that was the case. And actually, on another note, if we could stop having retrospectives and people could just talk to each other every day, that would be great with me, thanks. But I think that in most cases, setting time to reflect on what happened and to have an open discussion about it actually make things come out from under the carpet that they wouldn't have thought about. And yes, you can have some retrospectives where you think nothing much got out of this. But then you could start doing different things. You could start saying, well, we have we need to have a more narrow theme of this retrospective, then it's not just about our performance or the process. Maybe we should have a retrospective themed about our communication within our team. We could have a positive retrospective, where we just look at all the positive things. That's a thing that we often forget, and I often forget to mention, is that one of the good things about retrospectives is to focus on the things that went well and enforce those things that go well. Why did this go so well? Let's dive into the causes behind this. And another thing also is, especially for Danes, that giving each other compliments all the time can be that's also a dating pattern that I hadn't mentioned. But giving compliments is actually a good thing. Acknowledging people for the work that they do is a good thing. And that is something you could do in a retrospective as well. But if you think that they go stale and you don't get anything out of it, go online and look for different kinds of retrospectives. You could have a futurespective talking about the future instead. So what are our hopes and concerns about this project that we're starting right now? We could have a 6 thinking hats retrospective where we wear funny colored hats, and now we're only talking about hopes, now we're only talking about bad things. I think it's always a good idea. The short answer is yes. But I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I do retrospectives all the time with my kids, my husband, my family, myself. Everybody who gets close to me will have a retrospective afterwards. Any more questions? There's one down there. I know I'm between you and beer, so I'm aware of that fact.
Hi. Sometimes during retrospectives there are a lot of things to talk about, and since we are on a limited time schedule, we really can't spend all day for that, so we prioritize the things we talk about. But that leaves us with a lot of stuff that fall between the chairs. And then the next retrospective, the same thing. How do you tackle that? Thanks.
Thank you for the question. It's also a very interesting question. So I've got 3 different parts of an answer for that. The first part of that answer is, it's always a problem when I say, right, we're focusing on these 3 things, I'm going to throw the rest away. People will be crying and screaming and say, I want the post-it notes, please let me take notes. No, we'll throw it away. Because I genuinely believe that it's important to talk about what's important to you right now. And if it's still important in 2 weeks, it will pop up. So that's one answer. I also acknowledge in your question that sometimes there are the things that come up, but they are never chosen. And there's sort of a legacy problem in the democratic way that we vote in the retrospectives, which is that if we have, for instance, just one tester or one UX expert, then that vote doesn't count much towards the other 6 that are only interested in the build. And what I do in those circumstances is I sometimes, if I notice that it's a recurring problem, it's hard to see just from one retrospective, but if I see it as a recurring problem, I say, well, you have 3 votes for this kind of problems, and you have 1 vote for this kind of problems, to make sure that we actually focus on that part of the problem as well. But of course, you have to be aware of what it is. Did that answer your question? Sort of, yes. You could just meet me at the Meet the Speakers and follow up on it. And I think time is run out, hasn't it? The conference is over, ladies and gentlemen. There's Meet the Speakers and beer out there. Have fun.
Please remember to vote.
Oh yeah, please remember to vote. Yeah.
Thank you, Aino.